As early as 1980, the founder of the Heritage Foundation, Paul Weyrich, quite literally said, direct quote, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by the majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down." This is part 2 of my series on the Heritage Foundation. We're going to cover the creation, the funding, the first mandate for leadership, because as a reminder, Project 2025 is the 9th mandate for leadership, and we're going to touch on Ronald Reagan, his first administration, and how he partnered with the Heritage Foundation. So let's go back in time. We're going to recap quickly. Big L, liberalism has taken over America, and by that I mean the 1960s happened. Black Americans can vote without harm caused to themselves or their families. Public places have been desegregated. Schools have been desegregated legally. Lyndon Johnson has used the National Guard to desegregate public institutions. Women have more access to the pill. The sexual revolution has begun. Oh, and by the early 1970s, the women will actually be able to buy their own homes. Crazy. Woodstock happened. The Summer of Love happened. The Black Panthers were founded. Stonewall happened. The American Indian movement has taken over Alcatraz, demanding more tribal sovereignty. Federal hiring can no longer be discriminatory. And that is where we start today, right? On August 23rd, 1971, Lewis F. Powell Jr. writes the memo to Honorable Eugene B. Sydnor Jr., Chairman of the Education Committee of the U.S. Chamber of Congress, titled "The Attack on the American Enterprise System." In this memo, leaked just 1 year later by Washington Post journalist and Pulitzer Prize winner Jack Anderson, Powell attacks what he calls the new left, saying that from the universities, from the media, from the pulpit, from intellectuals and from the arts and the sciences, and even politicians, there's a constant attack on the rightful American enterprise system. The wild thing to me is it's almost like everyone was attacking the system. Almost like the system didn't work to begin with. Anyways, back to the Powell memo. Hindsight is, of course, 2020, but this shit is insane. In the kindest terms, really, truly, this man, Lewis Powell, soon to be a Supreme Court justice himself, says that every single tool in the toolbox needs to be utilized to push for the American enterprise system. Every single tool, right? He calls out Ralph Nader by name. Ralph Nader, before becoming a presidential candidate, is an activist. And he calls out General Motors for putting profits over people, right? You can read the entire memo online, but it is the backbone of the American conservative modern movement. Big C conservative, right? It's a mere 35 pages. It's written on a typewriter. So, if it was actually printed, it's probably 12 pages. But he prescribes a multi-front attack, and he prescribes aggression, right? From businesses, Powell says spending 10% of their advertising annual budget. He thinks that the tide could change. The tide could change away from labor towards conglomerates, towards General Motors, away from the people working towards the massive corporations if they just spent 10%. He calls for these businesses to proverbially get in the fucking game, right? He looks to the AFL-CIO and their labor movement and the way they use the courts to make these corporations do things for them, for their thousands of members of their union. He says, use them as an example, right? With educational institutions, he explicitly says that the Education Committee of the Chamber of Commerce would need to make sure that every single secondary educational institution should have equal conversations from both liberal and conservative voices, right? That visiting speakers should be regulated. He wants books and curriculums to be regulated. And then, of course, he calls on getting conservatives into the media, specifically television. He touches on other stuff, but specifically TV. TV is his goal in the short term. He thinks that will change hearts and minds while working on the educational aspect over the course of decades. Most notably, he says that a politically active Supreme Court, and more generally a judiciary arm, could be weaponized. Interesting. Okay, so now let's pop back over to our founders, right? We met Ed Feulner and Paul Weyrich in the last episode, but let's dig in a little bit further. Ed was born in Chicago in 1941. He starts his career at the Center for Strategic Studies, which is now called the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He became a congressional aide to Melvin Laird and then to Phil Crane. Now, Phil, Dan, and David Crane are the Kennedys of the right. I don't know. They're mainstays in the conservative movement. Don't worry, there's sexual misconduct in there too. They really do want to be like the Kennedys. Phil serves in the House of Representatives for 35 years. The first 8 of those years, Ed will be his right-hand man. And in 1977, 4 years after the founding of the foundation, the Heritage Foundation, Ed becomes the president, and he will remain the president until 2013. He'll have another brief stint in 2017 as well. So Paul is born in Wisconsin in 1942. He started his career working on Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign. He jumps into journalism, both radio and print, and then he becomes a press secretary for the U.S. Senator out of Colorado named Gordon Alcott in 1966. So with Ed in 1973, with the funding from Joseph Coors of the Coors family, they start the Heritage Foundation in 1973. He also notably starts the Committee for the Survival of a Free Congress in 1976, where he works tirelessly in Eastern Europe with Laszlo Pastor, a known Nazi sympathizer. He formed the Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell. He also coins the term moral majority, by the way, in the late 70s. And we know that he had to have read the Powell Memo. Everyone had read it, by the way. Everyone had read it. But we know this because he forms a group called the New Right. So we're back in 1973. Paul and Ed and other big C conservatives are shitting bricks. The 60s was a revolution. Every American has more opportunities than they did before. The Powell Memo has been leaked, and the conservative movement is looking for organization. They're looking for structure. They want a plan. They need a plan. People are like, what do we do when we arrive in these highest levels of offices and we don't know what to do? So they get that $250 from Joseph Coors, whose own brother, by the way, said that Joe's politics are just right of Attila the Huns. Taking the $250, which is about $1.8 million today, they begin to build a small team at first, but by 1976, under Weyrich's leadership, the annual income of the Heritage Foundation is close to $1 million, right? They'll find donors in Richard Mellon Scaife, and Frank J. Walton, right? And from Jason Stahl's book, The Right Moves, the conservative think tank in American culture since 1945, with Frank Walton's donation and his advice, the Heritage Foundation is going to perfect direct mail fundraising. They tapped into the untapped network of Christians, the conservative right, again with the moral majority, and Jerry Falwell's connections and the partnership that they create in the late 70s, right? And by 1981, under Ed Feulner's presidency, the annual budget per Stahl, again from his book, grows to $5.3 million. By 1979, it was decided a comprehensive plan needed to be written up if there were to be any sort of cohesive movement from the Big C conservative party in our country. And by 1980, both Ronald Reagan and his counterparts at the Carter campaign, they were both being pitched this 5-page outline for the first mandate for leadership. And Ronald Reagan and his team took the bait, right? When completed in 1981, this book, written on a typewriter originally, was about 3,000 pages. When it was bound as a book, it's about 1,000 pages. That's right. It is longer than the longest Harry Potter book. Yeah, I know you were thinking it. It has over 2,000 policy directives laid out, and that is how the mandate for leadership, policy management in a conservative administration, was born. Reagan liked it so much that he printed it out and had it passed around for all of his cabinet members at their first meeting, right? The paperback hits the bestsellers list. It is not an exciting read. I haven't read all of it because I can't find it. I'm not going to fucking buy it. But I have read all of Project 2025, and it's policy wonk bullshit. It's not fun, okay? But from Edward Lee's book, The Power of Ideas, he is also a former Heritage Foundation employee. The goal was to originally cut the size and the budget of the federal government to unwind decades of New Deal programs. But the very first policy directive is to increase the Department of Defense's budget by $20 billion. They also prescribed an increase of $35 billion, I believe an average of $35 billion over the next 5 years, right? We are still in the Cold War. The Berlin Wall is still up. The USSR has not fallen. We have proxy wars happening all over the fucking world. So that's a little context to that. But back to the mandate, right? Most importantly, per a 100-page memo that was printed just days after the election in 1980, was reversing the discrimination that was happening at the federal level. A large swath of laws, executive orders, and more, right? More being like actual implementation at the level, committee level, etc. Over the 60s and 70s made it easier to both spot discrimination and they made it illegal, right? Many opportunities were open to the best qualified American, best qualified applicant, no matter their race, no matter their gender, no matter their religious orientation, and more. The Heritage Foundation sought to end that immediately, right? And they really did dig into the U.S. Postal Service, and I couldn't figure out why until I realized that Richard Nixon had actually made an executive order about federal hiring and discrimination specifically in the U.S. Postal Service. But I do think this is where the hatred for the U.S. Postal Service truly begins, right? So these were programs aimed at giving many Americans more opportunities to have a better life, right? Qualified Americans, the best person for the job. And I know this because the data shows it, right? The data proves it. If you want to look into the data, you can look into hiring data, right? We know this from anecdotal stories, but more importantly, I think we have to talk about the fact that these programs actually affected every single American. They affect every single American. The Heritage Foundation claimed that this was reverse discrimination, but let me give you a few examples of who this helped and why it affects every American, even if you're not under one of these groups, right? Do you know a single mom? A single mom, super smart, just a single mom though, having a hard time getting a job, that covers the kids, that covers the bills, that covers everything. But she's so smart and you know she'd just do great anywhere. Do you know someone like that? Do you have an elderly neighbor who has literally so much life experience and would do so great at any single job because his brain is so fucking sharp, but he's not like steeped in AI, so he cannot get hired? Or maybe you have a kid in your neighborhood, at your church, in your school, who is one of the smartest kids you've ever seen, who literally like blows your mind every single time you speak to him, but he had the unfortunate luck of being born to people who have been in and out of jail for selling opioids. These types of people are the type of people that are aimed at in these programs, right? These are the type of people that actually would get more opportunities to get jobs with the federal government, among other groups, right? But these are the same people that the Heritage Foundation didn't want to have the same opportunities. They didn't want the best people for the job. Now, you might be saying, Amy, this all sounds familiar, but I can't put my finger on it. It should, right? These programs are now called diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're also called affirmative action. They've all been rolled back in 2025, right? After 40-some years, the Heritage Foundation got its wish. It turned a lot of Americans against diversity, equity, and inclusion using media, using businesses, using politicians, intellectuals, arts, sciences, pulpits. But I have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of Americans don't even know what diversity, equity, and inclusion really is. So, rolling back those anti-discrimination laws across the government, though, across the federal government, across state-level governments, across companies, also affects how the wealth in our country is distributed, right? Because when that kid whose parents have been in jail, in and out of jail, to no fault of his own, right? When he gets a good job, when our single moms get good jobs, when our elderly neighbors get good jobs and they have opportunities that they wouldn't have had before, they get paid. They get paid for the skills that they have. And when we roll back some of these programs that open the doors for these people who are well qualified, who are smarter than everyone else in the room to even get in the fucking door, we're withholding wealth. And the people withholding the wealth in this situation are the Heritage Foundation. Now, you might be saying, Amy, that's not how this works. The people who founded the Heritage Foundation had a great idea. They deserve the money. My question is, do they deserve to engineer a system that only makes them and their friends more money while shutting everyone else out? Anyways, I digress. So let's keep walking through this mandate, right? Even though the plan was to lower the budget of the federal government's size does increase, both size and budget, right? Albeit a little bit less than years before. Reagan said originally he would remove both the Department of Energy and the Department of Education from cabinet level positions. He doesn't do that. In fact, he actually adds Veterans Affairs as a cabinet level position. And though the mandate calls for a complete restructuring of the Federal Department of Education, that doesn't really happen either. The mandate itself, over those 3,000 pages, maps out $591 billion in federal spending, meaning every one page or so, it's mapping out $197 million. That's how fucking prescriptive it is. Like directives like which oil plot to lease out in California and things that are insanely narrow. It's so fucking detailed, though, that Mikhail Gorbachev makes a comment about it to Reagan. No shit. I'm not kidding. Other notable comparisons from the mandate to Reagan's first administration are the Reagan tax cuts in 1981, reducing the highest earners' taxes by 20% and the lowest earners' taxes by 3%. Reaganomics, in hindsight, did not work, and we know this, but that comes from the mandate as well, right? This is also allowing that wealth disparity to grow with the tax incentives, but also coupled with the fact that people are not getting the same opportunities, life begins to get harder, right? But the Heritage Foundation knew that their plan would take time. They knew it wouldn't be overnight, but they were pleasantly surprised with Reagan and his adoption of the mandate, right? Somewhere around 60% of those 2,000 policy directives were passed into law, including that tax cut. Enterprise zones were created by policies throughout the Reagan administrations, both of them, right? So if you feel like your city or your town or your village has no jobs, it's due in part from the Heritage Foundation, creating the policy around these enterprise zones that was bipartisan support, by the way. Those areas are focused for jobs, and when people tell you something like, hey, you should move out of this very expensive city to go live somewhere else, and you say, hey, my job's nowhere else, that's why. Yeah, we don't have local economies because of this type, right? This groundwork is laid in the 80s. It is foundational in the 80s and the 90s. And technically, it really happens in the second term, but it is in this first mandate. So, shall we recap? The Powell Memo lays out that plan to change the hearts and minds of the American people, starting with television and media. It does reference other forms of media as well, but you have to also think about pop culture at this moment, right? When's Wall Street out? I think it's 87. There is a time where it flips to greed is good. Greed is good, right? And then their long-term plan from the Powell Memo is using the universities, targeting young folks, making businesses get into the fucking game, and politicizing the judiciary and the Supreme Court. And by the way, as a Supreme Court justice, Justice Powell politicized his own shit a lot. But he didn't have the full backing of an entirely politically active Supreme Court like we have now. Reagan takes two mandate authors, he puts them in his administration. Again, he follows it so closely to the book that Gorbachev calls him out on it. Those tax cuts, the increase to the federal budget, destroying the anti-discrimination ideals laid out in the 60s, continuing the deregulation of the airlines and framing it all as this government's too big for its britches. And being a Hollywood man to boot. Certified decent-looking human being, unfortunately. He packaged the ideals of the Powell Memo and the Heritage Foundation as being the most American you can be. And I have to impress upon you, here and now, again, what I said up top, right? Paul Weyrich, founder of the Heritage Foundation in 1980 says, direct quote, "I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by the majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of this country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the election, quite candidly, goes down as the voting populace goes up." So while people think I might be jumping to conclusion by saying that the Heritage Foundation and their goals and their founders were to limit the civil liberties of and opportunities of the American people, you don't have to take my word for it. Take the founders, right? The deregulation of industry that began in the 70s and powered through in the 80s is part of why we're ruled by conglomerates now rather than small businesses, and why we don't have these neighborhood and local economies. And the attack on any criticism of the American enterprise system, or the attacks on the American enterprise system being called communist or anti-American, is actually just thinly veiled racism, misogyny, hatred of poor people and others. In part 3, we're going to cover mandates 2 and 3, I think. So that's the second Reagan administration, George H.W. Bush's solo administration. And we'll keep it fucking moving. Thanks for being here.